Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur, sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte cruel.
Over the last long period of time, the flu, the common flu, you know this, right? From 27,000 to 70,000 people get infected, and many people die. I think nobody knew that. I didn't know that. 3-4 weeks ago, I was sitting down and said, what do we lose with the regular flu? They said about 27,000 minimum, goes up to 70, sometimes even 80. One year it went up to 100,000 people. I said, nobody told me that. Nobody knows that.
No, people do know that. As bizarre and potentially injurious to public health as Donald Trump's statements about coronavirus have been, I mean, it actually is well known that the flu can be fatal. People do know that. Trump's dismissiveness toward the growing epidemic is actually not novel in American history. Back in 1918, a lethal, highly contagious version of the H1N1 virus that likely came from birds and was erroneously nicknamed the Spanish flu killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, including 675,000 Americans, more Americans than were killed in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and both world wars combined. It was and remains among the deadliest pandemics in human history. The flu broke out while the United States was knee-deep in World War I. And the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, was determined to keep morale up and, this is going to sound familiar, avoid panic. Part of his efforts included urging Congress to pass the Sedition Act, which made it punishable with 20 years in prison to, quote, utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government or the war effort. A law that ultimately suppressed reporting about the pandemic, while public health officials falsely claimed that there was no cause for alarm and that the Spanish flu was just ordinary influenza. And joining me now is Michael Beschloss, presidential historian for NBC News and the author of Presidents of War. It's great to talk with you, even in these odd circumstances, Michael. Thank you.
That's for sure, Joy. Thank you.
So I want to read a little bit of this, a piece from the Washington Post. It says Donald Trump is ignoring the lessons of the 1918 flu pandemic. And it says in Philadelphia, local officials were planning the largest parade in the city's history. This is back in 1918. Just before the scheduled event, about 300 returning soldiers started spreading the virus in the city. The parade was held, and 48 hours later, Spanish flu slammed the city. Even once schools were closed and public gatherings were banned, city officials claimed it wasn't a public health measure and there was no cause for alarm. Eventually, more than 12,500 residents died, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer. This desire by the Wilson administration to squash panic and to not let people know what was happening literally resulted in people being killed. And I think about Donald Trump. They're still having CPAC. They're still doing events. Maybe they'll still do rallies. It feels familiar to me.
It does. And, you know, Woodrow Wilson is probably the great negative historical example of how a president should manage a pandemic, because people got sick at a military installation in Kansas, and Wilson was told by his medical people, don't ship them to Europe because this pandemic is going to spread. Wilson said it's much more important to proceed with the war effort. He was worried that the president would become unpopular, or the government would become unpopular. And the result was that they were put on ships in very close quarters. They were later called coffin ships because they were so close together that the disease spread. A lot of people died, got to Europe. The illness spread through Europe. Under strict censorship, there wasn't very much known about it, and the reason it was called the Spanish flu was because Spain was a neutral country and reported on cases as some of these other countries did not, and so it took on this misnomer of Spanish flu. But Wilson was just a terrible manager of this. I mean, for instance, there was a nursing shortage because a lot of the nurses were working on soldiers who were at the front, and there were many trained African-American nurses who were available under the aegis of Woodrow Wilson's terrible racism. The African-American nurses were not called on.
Yeah, and there's even a story in the Smithsonian Magazine about how, just as you're talking about, these soldiers then come back to Kansas and spread it in Kansas because they wouldn't tell people. This idea of not reporting because you don't want the numbers to be high, that's something that Wilson did and that Donald Trump is doing now. The idea of trying to keep the numbers falsely low is in itself poor management because we just don't know how far it's spreading. I think that's what scares a lot of people.
That's it. And Wilson was recommended by his advisors, the medical ones, to say there should be quarantines. Wilson said no quarantines. They said, why don't you give a speech on the subject and tell Americans what's going on so that they can prepare and protect themselves? Wilson said, no, it's wartime. You know, I think that would be bad for morale. And he even said in private, you know, it's a bad thing that so many people are dying of influenza, but maybe they will hasten the end of World War I, of the World War, and therefore save a few lives.
Wow. Let me play Donald Trump doing his version of the Wilson sort of pretend that it's all going well. Here he is.
We have it totally under control. We think it's going to have a very good ending for us, so that I can assure you. It's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
The global death rate at 3.4%.
Well, I think the 3.4% is really a false number.
It's going to all work out. Everybody has to be calm. Came out of nowhere, but we're taking care of it. Calm. You have to be calm. It'll go away.
You know, Donald Trump doesn't listen to historians, unfortunately, but he does watch TV. So if he happens to be hate watching this morning, can you speak to him from the historical point of view about how this goes when you try to essentially pretend that a crisis is not a crisis?
Well, the Wilson example and many others suggest that the result will be that the crisis gets much worse. You know, people deserved to know what they could do to protect themselves at the time. In World War I, 106,000 Americans died fighting. 675,000, as you suggested, died in this influenza pandemic. Americans did. That was very much what was at stake. And I would also say, it turns out that President Trump's grandfather in 1918 is thought to have died of the flu connected to that pandemic.
Wow, that is very interesting. Wow. And the other piece of it is, and I'm seeing more and more anecdotal evidence, as I was talking with Ali Velshi about it earlier, of Donald Trump, because he has this absolute hold on his strongest supporters. They believe everything he says and nothing that you would say or that I would say. That in and of itself feels like a danger, that his hold on his people endangers both his people, his true believers, and everyone they come in contact with.
If he is giving out information that is not true or withholding information that he should, as Woodrow Wilson did. Because the real lesson for every president in a crisis like this, be transparent, get as much information out as possible. That's the way you at least curb this pandemic as much as possible.
It is Monday, the 9th of March of 2020, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam, and our daily special is River City Hash Mondays. Oh, what a weekend. Did you spring ahead? Oh, I did. We had to. Here in Oregon, there is a move afoot to just make it one time throughout the year. I just remember as a kid growing up in Oregon that I hated going to school in the dark and I hated coming home from school in the dark. So whatever time it is that you get more sun, let's have that one. I would have liked that as a kid, year round. So, some people are still acclimating themselves to that time change. Springing ahead, you ostensibly lose an hour, but you ostensibly make it up in the fall when you fall behind. That's right. Fall back. But let me tell you, kids, sleep is not like a savings account where you can put in a little bit and get interest. You got to get all the sleep that you need and as much as you need in one block, not spread out. Oh, I'm gonna catch up on that half hour a year from now. No, you won't. It doesn't work that way. I know it sounds reasonable, but it's not. So, give you a little bit of personal story here from the weekend. We had a little bit of an uproar, a little bit of a family thing revolving around the dementia of my elderly mom. And it is sad, and it's hard. It is really hard. So to be a proper caretaker means also swallowing your tongue a lot. And I don't know if you know me, or my family, but we were never taught to swallow our tongues. Let me tell you. So it is hard because it's my mom, and she's not well. And certain kinds of behaviors that were not, shall we say, when she was in her best light, have now become manifestly, exponentially profound. I mean, it is so massive. It's like the sort of stories we kind of believed in as kids. That, the reason that people got lobotomies is because they had certain kinds of behaviors that were not societal. And so let's scrape out that gooey stuff behind your eyebrow. And if people were all angry and agitated, they were docile and happy afterwards. So it looked like a miracle cure. Just scrape out that stuff behind the eyebrow and everything will be different. And it was. Unfortunately, what they found out, and this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but if the patient was in a particular mood around the time that they had the lobotomy, they would be locked into that mood. So rather than changing an aggressive mood, it would be permanent. Now, that's what we heard, and, as kids, staying up late, watching Channel 11, Los Angeles, Chiller Thriller, or any of the independent stations back in the day in Southern California that showed monster movies all night. Well, all of us who stayed up on the weekends and watched those monster movies all night on the weekend, it seemed reasonable to us. I mean, look at those mad scientists and what they did with the monsters and what the monsters did to them. So, take that out of a two-dimensional celluloid construct, put it into a four-dimensional universe of time, space, and irrational behavior. To be a proper caretaker, a lot of times you got to swallow your tongue. You got to gut it out. Because we love our moms. So outside of all that personal business, there was a lot going on in the world. And it isn't just COVID-19. Though I got to tell you, a lot of what's happening in the world is because of COVID-19. Boy, the stock market's taking a crash. I think people who were making really good money in the stock market, and that was the only reason that they liked Trump, other than the fact that they also got to be, abject, bully, racist, bigot, and misogynist. Outside of that, Trump was the best thing that ever happened to them. So I think now all they have to hold on to is being bigot, racist, misogynist bullies, but they're going to be broke. So I don't know. They may change their tune. Do we really? I mean, we can be bigot, racist, misogynist bullies without this guy who's like tanking my bank account. Do they think in those kind of nuances? I'm not so sure, but maybe a few of them will, and maybe they might have some sway. Maybe they'll shake a hand on it. Or two, or three, or four, or five. So what do we have curated for you today here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy? River City Ash Mondays, by the way. Well, of course, at the top, that was a breakdown from Bestloss about how Woodrow Wilson's lies about the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic, how it helped spread the disease that killed millions worldwide. Lie about something and people die. But I suppose if you have a guy at the top with profound narcissistic personality disorder, does he care? No, he lacks the empathy to care. Then, on the rest of the menu here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, ICE instituted a media blackout when asked what procedures are in place to protect immigrant detainees from COVID-19. Mondays are always hard. I'll get it out. I need more coffee. Yes, indeed. When asked about what procedures are in place, there is no word from ICE about what's happening in the icebox baby gulags. I got to say, maybe they're doing some medical research to see how long it'll take to kill a baby of coronavirus in an icebox baby gulag. I wouldn't put it above them. The Virginia legislature passed a bill allowing the removal of monuments honoring the treasonous Confederacy. Yeah, I'm glad that our military is renaming bases from the traitorous. They were traitors of the Confederacy, all those generals. Take their names off those military bases now. I don't see any Ho Chi Minh Marine base, there in El Toro, California. I don't see it. And Russia is using social media to create election chaos again. After the break, we move to the chef's table where no one can figure out why the Taliban declined to offer assurances of support for women's rights on International Women's Day. And Turkish police used tear gas to disperse the several dozen women left trying to celebrate their International Women's Day in Istanbul. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. I should mention that if you go to the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com, we are having some maintenance on the page. We are in the process of making the player and other parts of the page secure and available through all platforms. I just got some messages that we're down on TuneIn, and if you're trying to listen on TuneIn and you're listening to us now, you're not on TuneIn. So that may have, I don't know the particulars, but that may have something to do with what is going on with our homepage, which is tied into the server and various other tracking platforms and distributing platforms. So if that's the case, and you're listening to us, you found us. So good deal. Well, that said, normally if you go to our homepage, and I did go and the player is working, at least for me, on the unsecured part. I haven't checked whether it's secure yet because I think that there's still work being done. I hope that there's work being done because that would explain a lot of other things, and I'll get better word on that later. A message is out, and especially since I was told that this would be occurring probably really soon, if not now. And maybe that is what the issue is. But go to our homepage, and you'll notice the chat room link at the bottom of the homepage, right there by the social media scroll, and Kelly Lincoln takes care of that. To the leftish of the page is our Patreon link, and that is obviously where you would go if you wanted to become a recurring Patreon of Netroots Radio. We have been a powerhouse, though we be small. We are a powerhouse of resistance for going on 9 years now. And though we have survived the many attacks on us, from getting a laptop stolen right out of your house. How's that happen? Through a locked door, too. And windows closed. Eek. Scary. But nonetheless, I was not anything like, the Russian media doing it or anything. It's just one of those things. But regardless, we have survived so many attempts to, from the universe and by personal attacks, denial of service attacks from hostile foreign actors, maybe even from here in the States. You don't know. Well, we do, actually, and we turned it over. No, we didn't. But we know when these things have occurred because we were caught up in a greater net of it. Anyway, your generosity over all these many years has allowed us to fulfill our civic duty of resistance, as the founders originally intended, even before they wrote the Bill of Rights, probably even way before the Magna Carta. I think so. If you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter, it is so simple. You go simply to @Netroots Radio. Tom takes care of that grandly and perfectly, I might add. Very perfect. No, there's no satire. Thank you, Tom, because if it wasn't for Tom, there's a lot of stuff on the higher end and backbone part of this operation that would go asunder. And we count on Tom to, right the ship in that way. Thank you, Tom. If you would like to follow me on Twitter, do so @Justice Putnam. I post the show notes and links diary on Daily Codes about 10 minutes before showtime and get that out on social media, except for Facebook. Yeah, but our social media director will get that on Facebook. So, hey, Zuckerberg, you think? And I'm a little curious about, just let me intercede here about this Facebook suspension that should be lifted about the middle of the week. But I suspect another one is in line for me. Because apparently you don't harass dear leader in a private, uncensored group that no one can get into and see in the greater Facebook thing. But I suspect something a little bit closer to home is at play here. I'll fill you in a little bit more when I find out and root out what it is, but I have my suspicions. Anyway, I do post the show notes and links diary on Daily Codes and get that out on social media for your social media linkage pleasure. Follow the show on Twitter @CookbookWest and pick up podcasts by way of Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeart, YouTube, iTunes. I would have said TuneIn, but I don't know now. Where's TuneIn? And wherever podcasts can be found. All right, let's look into this first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, River City Hash Mondays. Dan Desai Martin of the American Independent brings us this first offering. Immigration officials say they are implementing new procedures at detention centers across the country in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 outbreak. But advocates and experts worry that more needs to be done in order to protect the health of those inside, because I don't think they really care. These kids have been dying of the regular flu on a regular basis. Of course, who knew? Who knew the regular flu killed so many people? No, I never knew that, so no one knew it. God, this guy. And they love that because they think the same thing. I never heard the sky was blue. Can you imagine? No one knew the sky was blue. And we're all standing around going, how can anybody be that? And you realize they are. And you're experiencing it right now, and it chokes you. You can't respond because you can't believe it. But it's true. A Customs and Border Protection spokesman said in an email that the agency was using, quote, existing procedures. Oh, you mean the ones that been allowing kids in icebox baby gulags to die face down on their own vomit from the throes of a fever brought on by the flu? Well, they want to know how they're going to keep the detainees safe from COVID-19, and since they're using the existing procedures, I presume that means nothing. And the spokesperson said the agency had issued guidance to all employees that outlines the current comprehensive use of personal protective equipment because if those kids are like rattled with diseases and you're testing them like the Germans did to see how long it takes, because you got film cameras going on too, so you can document it. You certainly don't want your Aryan personnel to get sick. And I know they're not all Aryans, but I'm just being rhetorical. Migrants identified with symptoms of COVID-19 may be provided with a mask. Maybe. They shall be. Not maybe. That means that they're not going to do that. And referred to CDC or EMS personnel for additional health screening, the spokesperson said. The agency is also identifying individuals who have recently traveled to China or Iran within the previous 14 days for enhanced health screenings. Now, neither Custom Border Protection or ICE responded to questions about if and how they are implementing those recommendations inside their respective detention facilities, or if they have the capacity to quarantine individuals who have been infected with COVID-19. Some have noted that ICE has specifically been silent on the matter thus far and has not issued any news or press releases about coronavirus or COVID-19 at all. You mean it's almost like a media blackout? Sarah Rankin of the Associated Press brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, River City Hash Mondays. Some of Virginia's scores of Confederate monuments could soon be removed under legislation state lawmakers approved Sunday. Oh my, they work on the day of rest. The Democratic-led House and Senate passed measures that would undo an existing state law that protects the monuments and instead let local leaders and governments decide their fate. The passage marks the latest turn in Virginia's long-running debate over how its history should be told in public spaces. Well, if it's a history that says we were treasonous, seditious assholes and we should have never done it, okay. How about maybe erecting monuments to the people trying to prevent you from becoming treasonous, seditious F-ups? How about honoring that? How about erecting some monuments to that? How about looking at your history in those eyes, you know, like an American? After white supremacists descended on Charlottesville in 2017, in part to protest the city's attempt to move a statue of the traitor General Robert E. Lee, many places across the country quickly started taking Confederate monuments down. But Virginia localities that wanted to remove the monuments were hamstrung by existing law. In the two legislative sessions that followed the rally, Republican lawmakers defeated bills like the one passed yesterday, but Democrats recently took full control of the state house for the first time in a generation. Virginia, a state that prides itself on its pivotal role in America's early history, is home to more than 220 public memorials to the treasonous Confederacy, according to state officials. They don't call them the treasonous Confederacy, though. They refer it as, what is it called now? The attack from the north. It was something that, you know, we attacked them. Like they were a separate country unto themselves. Figure that one out. Critics say the monuments are offensive to African Americans because they romanticize the Confederacy and ignore its defense of slavery. Well, if you go to some of these monuments, you'll find out that the slaves just loved having the crap beat out of them with a whip. And they like living in their little slave quarters out in the fields, you know, sometimes on just hay. It was so pastoral. It wasn't very American, but it was certainly antebellum. anything touches upon Russia, you would expect and hope that there are anonymous worker bees in any of the news organizations attending to the reportage. And in this case, there are anonymous worker bees at the Associated Press attending to this. 4 years after Russia-linked groups stoked divisions in the U.S. presidential election on social media platforms, a new report shows that Moscow's campaign hasn't let up and has become harder to detect. Yeah, it hasn't started again. It never stopped, but it's ramped up, and it's even more sophisticated now. The report from University of Wisconsin-Madison professor Young-Mi Kim found that Russia-linked social media accounts are posting about the same divisive issues, race relations, gun laws, and immigration as they did in 2016 when the Kremlin polluted American voters' feeds with messages about the presidential election. Facebook has since removed the accounts. Yeah, but don't say anything untoward to dear leader. You'll be considered to be a bully and a harasser. Since then, however, the Russians have grown better at imitating U.S. campaigns and political fan pages. And Kim said, and she's analyzed thousands of posts. Well, I guess she studied more than 5 million Facebook ads during the 2016 election, identifying Russia's fingerprints on some of the messages through an ad tracking app. Her review is co-published by the Brennan Center for Justice, a law and policy institute where she is a scholar. The Russian improvements make it harder for voters and social media platforms to identify the foreign interference, Kim said. For normal users, it is too subtle to discern. By mimicking domestic actors with similar logos and similar names, they are trying to avoid verification. Kim's report comes weeks after U.S. intelligence officials briefed lawmakers on Russian efforts to stir chaos in American politics and undermine public confidence in this year's election. And with that meeting, the Republican Vichy collaborators stormed out, screaming, No, you're just trying to keep Trump from winning the election. Well, damn right. It's democracy. Do you know where you are? This isn't the Duma. This isn't the Politburo. Last month, FBI Director Chris Wray warned that Russia was still waging information warfare with an army of fictional social media personas and bots that spread disinformation. But intelligence officials have not released any details about the type of disinformation or explained how Americans should protect themselves from it, because the same guys, and I got to tell you, they're all guys, running this. We're also running the CDC. Well, that brings us to our break period, and we better go to our break. So when we get back from said break, we will go through weather from around the world and finish up with the stories that we have curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
This is Take Two Movie Review. I'm Mike Friend. This week, a Me Too day at the office. In the powerful but understated The Assistant, we get a look at a Weinstein-esque web of abuse far different from that in Bombshell or The Loudest Voice. There are no sex scenes or humiliated women commiserating. What we have is an assistant, Jane, played by Julia Garner from the Netflix series Ozark, beginning a day before dawn at an office, making coffee, fixing the copier, etc., all in the hopes of one day getting a shot at producing from the connected entertainment mogul who runs the company. She moves about her day amidst printer noises and off-camera conversations which gradually become foreground. She finds a piece of jewelry in the boss's office, engages with his wife on the phone, then with the boss about how she engaged with the wife. Then there are frat boys, plus a couple of years, who work in the office, listen in on phone calls, giggle, and give her borderline demeaning advice on ways to placate the big guy. Eventually, she's expected to onboard a second assistant, 18 years old and from South Dakota, and who's being housed at a 5-star hotel where the boss is known to take meetings. This causes her to go to see the HR manager, played by Matthew McFadden, who explains things with the same attitude he brings off in HBO's Succession. The published credits contain sort of a spoiler. There's no potentially oxygen-sucking male character as the boss, just a phone voice, a pivotal and bold decision from director Kitty Green that transforms the movie. The assistant is a day-in-the-life picture. It covers no ground and reaches no conclusions, but as Garner's weary Jane makes her way home that night, still employed, character and audience have plenty to consider. This has been Take Two Movie Review. I'm Mike Friend. Catch up with us at take2moviereview.com and feed us back on our channel on YouTube.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Christopher Intagliata. Beethoven is a giant of classical music, and the most influential, too, at least when it comes to piano compositions. That's according to a study in the journal EPJ Data Science. If you're wondering how data analysis could determine something as intangible as cultural influence, it's worth remembering this.
The great thing about music is that it is the most mathematical of the art forms we actually can deal with, because a lot of it is symbolic. It's temporal, so we have like symbols. The music is divided using symbols that are connected in time.
Ju-Young Park is a theoretical physicist by training and associate professor of culture technology at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. Park and his colleagues collected 900 piano compositions by 19 composers, spanning the Baroque, Classical, and Romantic periods, from 1700 to 1910. Then they used that mathematical quality to their advantage by dividing each composition into what they called code words, a group of simultaneously played notes, in other words, a chord. They then compared each chord to the chord or note that came after it, which allowed them to determine how creative composers were at coming up with novel transitions. The composer who won top marks for novelty, Rachmaninoff. But when the researchers looked at those chord transitions across all 19 composers, it was Beethoven who was the most heavily borrowed from, meaning at least among the composers in this analysis, his influence loomed the largest. Their study does come with a couple caveats. Again, the researchers only considered piano compositions in this work, not orchestral works. And by only studying chord transitions, their conclusions wouldn't capture artists who were influential in other ways.
It's well understood. I found out that Mozart's contribution to evolution of music comes from the musical forms that he devised, and that was not very well captured by our mathematical modeling.
As for Park, the results convinced him he has some listening to do.
Of course, I do like Rachmaninoff's music, but I have to confess that I have listened to Beethoven way more than Rachmaninoff. So after this work came out, I ended up buying like this whole complete Rachmaninoff collection from Amazon and waiting for this collection to arrive.
Seems that Park turned a minor interest into a major commitment, in a key way. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Christopher Intagliata.
This program is presented by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
For an expectant mother, taking care of her developing baby means taking good care of herself. One way she can do this is by ensuring she gets vaccinated. If a woman is or might be pregnant during flu season, it's especially important to get her annual flu shot, preferably before the end of October. In addition, women should be vaccinated against whooping cough during the 3rd trimester of each pregnancy. Failure to get vaccinated places both mother and baby at increased risk for serious complications of these infections, including hospitalization and even death. If you're pregnant or planning to get pregnant, ask your healthcare provider when you should get your vaccines. Thank you for joining us on A Minute of Health with CDC.
For the most accurate health information, visit cdc.gov or call 1-800-CDC-INFO.
Hi, I'm Tom Hartman, and since you're listening to netrootsradio.com, Show your progressive side and go to the donate button on the bottom of the homepage. It's progressives like you who power Netroots Radio and keep the progressive message beaming everywhere 24 hours a day. Just go to our donate button at the bottom of netrootsradio.com. Thank you for keeping progressive radio at full power.
Welcome to 60 Second Civics, the daily podcast of the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. Citizens have vital roles in our government. One important role is to monitor the decisions and actions of government. Citizens monitor government to be informed about what the government is doing in their name. They also monitor government to ensure that it serves the purposes for which it was created. Another important role of citizens is to attempt to influence the decisions and actions of government. It is the right of citizens to try to influence the decisions and actions of government that affect our lives. In a sense, citizenship is an office of government. Some people might say that it is the highest office of government because citizens are the source of government's authority. Like any other office, citizenship carries important responsibilities. That's all for today's podcast, 60 Second Civics, where civic education only takes a minute.
Can it really be a federal crime to save people who otherwise will die of dehydration and exposure? I'm Bill Newman, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute. The United States government insisted that the answer is yes when it prosecuted individuals in Arizona who belonged to the Unitarian Universalist Church and its humanitarian aid organization ministry, No More Deaths, No Mas Muertes. The members of No More Deaths leave supplies, food, water, and medicine in the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, which borders Mexico, along footpaths used by persons entering the United States without legal permission. It's one of the most extreme environments in North America and has no safe drinking water. According to the Pima County Medical Examiner, 2,816 sets of, quote, undocumented border crosser remains, end quote, were recovered in Arizona between 2000 and 2017. The defendants claim protection from prosecution under the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And on January 31st, the Federal District Court in Arizona found that their religious beliefs were sincere and that prosecuting them by the government was not necessary to achieve the government's legitimate goals. The court rejected the government's final justification that more deaths could mean fewer crossings as gruesome logic, totally speculative, and unsupported by evidence. The court then dismissed the criminal charges of driving and being and leaving water in the refuge in a victory for conscience and religious freedom in America. The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the ACLU because freedom can't protect itself.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1911. That was the day that coal miners in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, walked out of the mines. It became known as the Slovak Strike because 70% of the strikers were Slovakian immigrants. Unrest was mounting among workers in the non-unionized coal fields. Tens of thousands of miners were signing up to be members of the United Mine Workers of America. And the union was winning improved working conditions and wages for their members, including the 8-hour day. But the Westmoreland miners were not unionized. They still had to work 10-hour days. Then, the Keystone Coal Company required the miners to use new safety lights and explosives. The miners had to pay for these items out of their own pockets. Outraged, the miners met to formulate a response. 400 men joined up to a new UMWA local. The company cracked down immediately. They fired 100 men who had attended the meeting. Some were long-term employees who had worked for more than 2 decades in the mines. The miners walked off the job to protest the firings. Soon, the strike spread beyond the Keystone Coal Company. Miners joined the strike from 65 mines belonging to 30 companies. The mining companies responded with every tactic in their arsenals. They evicted the miners from their company homes. They won injunctions against picketing. They recruited recent immigrants from Eastern Europe as scabs. They paid off police who responded brutally to the strikers. 16 miners were killed. Although the strikers held out for 16 months, the strike ended in defeat, with many of the strikers being blacklisted from future work in the coal fields. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com.
I read the news today, oh boy.
It's time for Nicole Sandler's What's News from NicoleSandler.com and the Progressive Voices Network.
Senator Elizabeth Warren announced on Thursday that she's ending her 2020 Democratic presidential bid, essentially turning the race into a one-on-one battle between Senator Bernie Sanders and former Vice President Joe Biden.
I will not be running for president in 2020, but I guarantee I will stay in the fight for the hardworking folks across this country who've gotten the short end of the stick over and over. That's been the fight of my life, and it will continue to be so.
Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard is still officially in the race, but having garnered only 2 delegates from her second-place Super Tuesday finish in American Samoa, she has no path to the 1,991 delegates needed to secure the nomination. As for Sanders and Biden, both candidates are gearing up for next Tuesday, as 6 states will hold primaries or caucuses with intense focus on Michigan, a key general election state that has 125 delegates up for grabs. Sanders' team announced that instead of holding a rally in Jackson, Mississippi, he will instead be campaigning in Michigan, the only swing state contest next week, on Friday and Sunday, going all out to win there in what has become a must-win contest. Sanders eked out a victory over Hillary Clinton in Michigan in 2016, taking the state by 1.5 points. A federal judge on Thursday criticized Attorney General William Barr's handling of former special counsel Robert Mueller's report on Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election, saying Barr, quote, distorted the findings when he first described them to the public. U.S. District Court Judge Reggie Walton, the D.C.-based judge overseeing a lawsuit brought by BuzzFeed News and the watchdog group Electronic Privacy Information Center, ruled that he would review an unredacted version of Mueller's report to evaluate inconsistencies that he saw between Barr's public statements last year and the partially redacted version released to the public. Walton said the discrepancies led him to, quote, seriously question whether Attorney General Barr made a calculated attempt to influence public discourse about the Mueller report to help President Trump. Jason Leopold, the intrepid BuzzFeed News reporter who brought the lawsuit, is one of my guests on Friday's edition of The Nicole Sandler Show, heard on Progressive Voices at 5 p.m. Eastern or available anytime after at NicoleSandler.com. The Senate on Thursday passed a more than $8 billion spending package for fighting coronavirus in a 96-1 vote, sending it to the president. By the way, that one no vote was Rand Paul. The House approved the bill on Wednesday, which includes $2.2 billion to help local, state, and federal agencies prepare to respond with testing, infection control, and tracking contacts of people who test positive. There are now 228 coronavirus cases and 14 deaths in the U.S. Pentagon officials said efforts to develop vaccines may not be quick enough to wipe out the virus before a second wave hits next winter. Meanwhile, members of the union National Nurses United said they have faced shifting guidelines and a shortage of supplies as the tally of known coronavirus infections has increased. The nurses called on the Centers for Disease Control to quickly increase testing for COVID-19 and demanded that federal officials implement emergency standards for hospitals and clinics around the country. Bonnie Castillo of National Nurses United shared a letter from a nurse currently in quarantine after caring for patients with the virus in Northern California and showing symptoms but cannot get tested.
I volunteered to be on the care team for this patient who we knew was positive. I did this because I had all the recommended protective gear and training from my employer. I did this assuming that if something happened to me, of course, I too would be cared for. Then, what was a small concern after a few days of caring for this patient became my reality. I became sick. When employee health told me that my fever and other symptoms fit the criteria for potential coronavirus, I was put on a 14-day quarantine. My doctor ordered the test through the county. The public county officer called me and verified my symptoms and agreed with testing. But the national CDC would not test me because if I were wearing the recommended protective equipment, then I wouldn't have the coronavirus. What kind of science-based answer is that?
Of the 6,500 members who took a survey by National Nurses United, only 30% said their employer has sufficient protective equipment. The state of Alabama Thursday night executed Nathaniel Woods, a man convicted in the 2004 killings of 3 police officers who were shot by another man. Supporters, including the son of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., waged a last-minute appeal to stop the execution as the case drew national attention. Woods' co-defendant, Kerry Spencer, who is now on death row, has confessed that he was the one who pulled the trigger, saying that Woods was innocent of the killings. And that's just a bit of what's news for now. I'm Nicole Sandler. If you appreciate these reports and the Nicole Sandler Show, I hope you'll consider making a contribution. My work is 100% listener supported, and I can't do it without your help. Find out more at NicoleSandler.com. Please click on that donate button.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, River City Hash Mondays. We always begin weather from around the world along the banks of the Rogue River and the Rogue River Valley of Southern Oregon on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where it is currently 40 degrees Fahrenheit, expecting temperatures a tad higher than we've had over the weekend. Bit of rain, not heavy, though we did have some big drops that had some spaces between them. But pretty much a steady light rain for most of the weekend. Expecting a high of around 58 to 60, cloudy early with peaks of sunshine expected late. Winds are light and variable. Clear skies tonight with lows in the low 30s. And winds will be light and variable. High tomorrow in the mid-60s. Sunny skies with winds light and variable. Pollen is still rated at none. The air quality index is good at 22 parts per million, and that daytime UV index is moderate at a springtime level of 4. Visibility, barometric pressure is falling at 30.17 inches. Visibility is down to 4 miles. There's quite a bit of fog out right now, clearing up later. And relative humidity is at 92%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by people's personal weather stations that they purchased. These people planted these purchased personal weather stations somewhere on their property, and these people positively live around the world. London is 51 and mostly cloudy. Paris is 54 and mostly cloudy. Rome is 57, partly cloudy with a quarantine. Kyiv is 47 with rain. Kabul is 46 and partly cloudy. Hong Kong is 72 and mostly cloudy with a quarantine of their own. Tokyo is 57 and cloudy and quarantined. Sydney, Australia is 64 and mostly cloudy. San Francisco, California is 48 degrees and partly cloudy. And New York is 53 degrees Fahrenheit and sunny. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by people's personal weather stations that they purchased. These people planted these purchased personal weather stations somewhere on their property. And these people positively live around the world. Anonymous worker bees, this time at Reuters, bring us this first amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Some political leaders joined foreign envoys in Afghanistan in offering assurances of support for women's rights on International Women's Day, but the Taliban did not join in the global commemoration, and the mind reels trying to figure out why. Just over a week after the Islamist militant group and the United States signed a deal intended to end an 18-year-old war, many Afghan women are worried about what it will mean for their rights, and does Trump care? Hell no. We respect women. We congratulate our women, mothers, sisters, wives, and relatives, but not under the name of 8th March as Women's Day, because it is not in Islam and Sharia. Taliban spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid said the Taliban did not allow women to be educated or leave the house without a male relative when it ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001 and forced them to cover their faces. The group said it would now allow women to be educated and work, but many women worry that the deal reached last month with the U.S. does not include adequate safeguards for women's rights, because if the Taliban is going to, bomb people, because let's be clear, the United States lied to them to broker the deal, and they lied to the Afghani government to broker the deal. Do they really care about the rights of women in Afghanistan? Please.
Je te donne ce mon amour pour la vie entière, la promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle, c'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer, mes automnes quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers, c'est tout.
This final amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy is brought to us by Amin Kaliskan at Reuters. Turkish police used tear gas to disperse a few dozen women who were still in central Istanbul after trying to march on Sunday evening to celebrate International Women's Day. Reuters reporters saw the crowd, which was originally a few hundred women at the edge of Taksim Square holding banners and waving flags. The police formed a human blockade to stop the hussies from advancing. Entering Istanbul Street, the district's main pedestrian avenue. I guess that would be Istiklal Street. As part of the crowd dispersed, as they were not allowed to march, the few left were then pretty much mowed down by tear gas. How nice. Istanbul's governor, Ali Yurkalakaya, decided to close down Taksim's metro station and parts of nearby Shashain station, and said all roads leading to the main square would be blocked because those women were coming to celebrate their day. The government did allow some activities by non-governmental organizations to celebrate International Women's Day around the city, but the government said the gathering in Istiklal Street was not granted a permit. So last year on International Women's Day, the police fired tear gas to break up a crowd of women who had gathered for the march. So it's just, carrying on the festivities that has already been established from previous times. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day. But you do know that Netroots Radio is going to broadcast on, and we will meet up tomorrow for Terrytown Chowder Tuesdays. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night for all the breaking news as it breaks. And we'll meet up here tomorrow, right here in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Robe à fleurs, sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goël. Je voudrais toujours te plaire, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair, t'embrasser les yeux ouverts, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver.